December 7, 1941. 10 miles off the coast of Oahu, territory of Hawaii. Lieutenant Mochitsura Hashimoto stood as torpedo officer aboard the Imperial Japanese Navy submarine SIM-24, watching through the pre-dawn darkness as the submarine's midget submarine detached for its attack run toward Pearl Harbor. Hours later, as flames rose from Battleship Row and smoke blackened the Hawaiian sky, Japanese officers across the Pacific celebrated what seemed an impossible victory against the industrial giant they had been warned could never be defeated. Around Hashimoto, fellow officers expressed confidence that American naval power had been crippled permanently, that the technological superiority of Japanese weapons would ensure continued dominance. What none of them understood was that in those burning harbors lay the seeds of Japan's ultimate destruction, and that the weapon which would sink their empire was already being loaded into American submarines, flawed beyond comprehension, dismissed by Japanese intelligence as evidence of American technological inferiority. The mathematics of Japanese naval defeat were being written not in the spectacular carrier battles that would capture headlines, but in the grinding technical failures of American torpedoes that would paradoxically lead to the most devastating submarine campaign in naval history. The pattern of mutual misunderstanding and technological contempt had begun long before the first bombs fell on Pearl Harbor. The arrogance started on May 13, 1940, when a walk-in source, whose identity remains classified to this day, provided the United States naval attaché in Tokyo with detailed intelligence about the Type 93 oxygen torpedo. This weapon, which Allied forces would later nickname the Long Lance, represented the pinnacle of Japanese naval engineering and a technological achievement that should have terrified American naval planners. The specifications were extraordinary, and to Western eyes almost unbelievable. With a range exceeding 22,000 yards at 48 knots and 33,000 yards at slower speeds, carrying a warhead of 1,080 pounds of high explosive, it was the most advanced torpedo in the world by a considerable margin. The source provided technical drawings, performance data, and operational doctrine that detailed exactly how Japanese destroyers and cruisers would employ this weapon in night surface actions. The Office of Naval Intelligence carefully evaluated the report, forwarded it to the Bureau of Ordnance for technical assessment, and received back a conclusion that would prove catastrophically wrong. The Bureau dismissed the intelligence entirely. The reasoning was simple and reflected prejudices that permeated Western military thinking about Asian capabilities. Japanese engineers, the Bureau concluded, could not possibly have developed a torpedo more advanced than American weapons. The use of pure oxygen as an oxidizer, while theoretically possible, was deemed too dangerous and too sophisticated for an Asian naval power to master safely. The report was filed away and largely forgotten. Over the following months, as tensions with Japan escalated, this intelligence failure would cost thousands of Allied lives and dozens of warships. This dismissal reflected a broader contempt that permeated Western military thinking about Japanese capabilities in the years leading to war. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, who would later command amphibious forces in the Pacific and earn 4 Navy Crosses for his service, had testified before Congress in 1940 that Japanese pilots were inferior due to supposed racial characteristics that affected their vision and spatial awareness. These racist assumptions, presented as scientific fact, insisted that Japanese aviators lacked the night vision necessary for effective combat operations, that their technical training was inadequate compared to Western standards, that their aircraft were copies of Western designs with inferior metallurgy. Army Air Corps intelligence assessments from 1941 confidently stated that the Zero fighter was a derivative of obsolete American designs and would prove no match for American aircraft in combat. These assumptions would cost American lives in the opening months of the war, when Japanese pilots, flying technically superior aircraft and employing sophisticated tactical doctrine, dominated the skies over the Philippines, Wake Island, and the Dutch East Indies. The cost of this intelligence failure became apparent almost immediately after Pearl Harbor. 7 American cruisers would be sunk by Type 93 torpedoes during the Pacific War. The heavy cruisers Quincy, Vincennes, Astoria, Chicago and Northampton fell to long lances fired from ranges the Allies thought impossible. 9 destroyers were sent to the bottom by these weapons. The fleet aircraft carrier Hornet, already crippled by dive bombers at the Battle of Santa Cruz, received the coup de grace from destroyer-launched Type 93 torpedoes. Over 3,100 American sailors died as a direct result of long lance hits. In most cases, the ships believed themselves safely beyond torpedo range when the weapons struck. Lookouts scanning the horizon saw no enemy vessels close enough to pose a threat. Captains maneuvering their ships believed they were operating outside the danger zone based on intelligence estimates of Japanese torpedo capabilities. Then, long lances, launched from cruisers and destroyers 15 or even 20 miles away, would slam into hulls and detonate with devastating effect. The first encounter came at the Battle of the Java Sea on February 27, 1942. Dutch Rear Admiral Karel Doorman, commanding a scratch force of American, British, Dutch and Australian cruisers and destroyers, led his ships out of Surabaya to intercept a Japanese invasion convoy approaching Java. The Allied force consisted of the heavy cruisers Exeter and Houston, the light cruisers De Ruyter, Java and Perth, and 9 destroyers representing 4 different navies with 4 different tactical doctrines and significant language barriers hampering communication. Doorman was a competent officer thrust into an impossible situation, commanding ships that had never operated together, with crews exhausted from months of continuous retreat, facing a Japanese force that had trained together for years and operated with unified command and doctrine. The battle began at 1600 hours when Japanese and Allied forces made visual contact. From beyond visual range for most Allied vessels, the Japanese heavy cruisers Haguro and Nachi and the light cruiser Naka, supported by destroyers, manoeuvred to bring their torpedo batteries to bear. At 16:33 hours, the light cruiser Naka launched 4 Type 93 torpedoes at a range of 15,000 yards. Her escorting destroyers followed, launching 27 more torpedoes between 1640 and 1645 hours from ranges between 13,000 and 15,000 yards. At 1652 hours, the heavy cruiser Haguro added 8 more torpedoes from the almost unbelievable range of 22,000 yards, over 11 nautical miles. The sea between the Japanese and Allied forces filled with nearly 40 long lances running at depths of 12 feet, leaving no wakes, their oxygen propulsion systems producing no telltale bubbles. Allied lookouts and sonar operators, trained to detect torpedoes at much shorter ranges based on American and British torpedo capabilities, saw nothing until it was too late. At 17:13 hours, 1 Type 93 struck the Dutch destroyer Kortenaer amidships. The half-ton warhead detonated against the destroyer's thin hull plating, the explosion breaking her back. Kortenaer jackknifed and sank in less than 2 minutes, taking most of her crew of 150 with her. Allied commanders, unable to comprehend torpedo attacks from such extreme ranges, concluded that submarines must be responsible. Throughout the remainder of the battle, Allied vessels manoeuvred frantically to avoid what they believed were submarine-launched torpedoes, disrupting their formation and preventing coordinated attacks on the Japanese surface force. The battle raged for 7 hours as Doorman attempted repeatedly to reach the invasion transports, and Japanese surface forces manoeuvred to block him. The heavy cruiser Exeter took an 8-inch shell hit that penetrated her boiler room, reducing her speed and forcing her out of line. The British destroyer Electra was sunk by gunfire after making a gallant but futile torpedo attack. Doorman's force, reduced to 4 cruisers after the American destroyers withdrew due to fuel and ammunition shortages, continued searching for the invasion convoy through the night. At 23:25 hours, Japanese cruisers Haguro and Nachi, tracking the Allied force by radar, launched another spread of torpedoes from long range. At 2332 hours, 1 Type 93 struck the light cruiser Java, the explosion igniting her magazines. Java blew apart and sank almost instantly, taking 512 of her crew of 600 with her. Minutes later, at 23:38 hours, another long lance struck Dorman's flagship De Ruyter. The torpedo detonated against the cruiser's ammunition magazines, triggering a catastrophic secondary explosion. De Ruyter broke in half and sank within minutes, killing Rear Admiral Dorman and 345 of his crew. The Battle of the Java Sea cost the Allies 2 light cruisers, 3 destroyers, and approximately 2,300 sailors killed. Japanese losses were 4 transports hit by stray torpedoes from their own cruiser Mogami, and minor damage to 1 destroyer. The invasion of Java proceeded without further interference. More significantly, the battle demonstrated the lethality of the Type 93 torpedo and the Allied inability to counter it. Yet American intelligence, analysing battle reports and interrogating survivors, refused to believe that surface ships had launched torpedoes from the ranges reported. The assessment remained that submarines were responsible, that Japanese surface torpedo capabilities were comparable to Allied weapons, that reports of extreme-range torpedo attacks were exaggerations by exhausted crews under extreme stress. This pattern continued at the Battle of Savo Island on August 9, 1942, one of the worst defeats in United States Navy history. At 01:43 hours, Japanese float planes dropped parachute flares over the Allied cruiser force protecting the Guadalcanal landings, silhouetting the American and Australian ships against the night sky. Within minutes, Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa's force of 5 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 1 destroyer had closed to torpedo range. The battle lasted 32 minutes. When it ended, the Australian heavy cruiser Canberra was sinking, having taken 2 Type 93 torpedo hits and 24 8-inch shell hits. The American heavy cruisers Quincy, Vincennes, and Astoria were all aflame and would sink before dawn. The heavy cruiser Chicago limped away with her bow blown off by a torpedo hit. Over 1,000 Allied sailors died that night, trapped below decks as their ships burned and sank, or killed instantly by torpedo detonations that broke their vessels apart. American survivors reported torpedoes coming from impossible ranges and directions, weapons that left no visible wakes, detonations from angles that suggested Japanese torpedoes could turn and maneuver after launch. Intelligence officers dismissed these reports as combat confusion, the natural tendency of survivors to exaggerate threats and rationalize defeat. The assessment remained that Japanese torpedoes were roughly equivalent to American weapons, perhaps slightly better in certain characteristics, but not dramatically superior. This willful blindness to evidence would persist until 1943, when examination of intact Type 93 torpedoes recovered from sunken Japanese destroyers finally confirmed that the pre-war intelligence had been accurate. By then, thousands of Allied sailors had died, and dozens of ships had been lost to a weapon American intelligence insisted couldn't exist. This willful blindness to Japanese technological capabilities mirrored Japanese attitudes toward American weapons, creating a symmetrical intelligence failure that would have far different consequences for the two powers. As American submarines began war patrol operations in December 1941, Japanese naval intelligence officers compiled reports on early American torpedo attacks, with barely concealed satisfaction and growing confidence that the submarine threat was manageable. The reports documented failure after spectacular failure, malfunctions so consistent that they suggested fundamental flaws in American torpedo design and American submariner training. On December 14, 1941, just 7 days after Pearl Harbor, the submarine Seawolf, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Frederick Warder, encountered a Japanese freighter anchored off the southern coast of Mindanao in the Philippines. Warder maneuvered his boat into perfect attack position, range 3,000 yards, target stationary and unescorted. He fired 8 Mark 14 torpedoes, the standard weapon of the American submarine force, each costing over $10,000 and representing months of production effort. 7 torpedoes missed entirely, passing beneath the target or running wild. The 8th struck the freighter squarely amidships. Seawolf's crew heard the dull clang of metal striking metal through the submarine's hull. No explosion followed. The Torpedo, its warhead packed with 643 pounds of Torpex explosive, had hit the target directly and failed to detonate. The freighter, its crew alerted to the submarine's presence, got underway and escaped, while Seawolf dove to avoid the depth charge attack that never came, because the Japanese vessel had no anti-submarine weapons aboard. On December 24, 1941, Christmas Eve, the submarine Sargo, commanded by Commander Tyrrell Jacobs, encountered 4 Japanese cargo ships off the coast of Indochina, steaming in a loose convoy without escort. Jacobs manoeuvred his boat into textbook attack positions, firing 3 torpedoes at each of 4 targets, 12 torpedoes total from ranges between 1,000 and 2,000 yards. The conditions were perfect. The sea was calm, visibility excellent, the targets making steady courses and speeds. Every torpedo either missed entirely or malfunctioned. Not a single explosion. Jacobs observed through his periscope as torpedo after torpedo passed beneath targets or struck and failed to explode, or exploded prematurely without causing damage. He fired his final attack, the last 4 torpedoes in his forward tubes, at a large cargo ship that had stopped and was lowering boats to investigate what was happening. All 4 torpedoes ran beneath the stationary target. Sargo returned to Manila Bay on December 30th, her crew demoralized, having expended all 24 torpedoes aboard without sinking a single ship. Commander Jacobs filed a scathing after-action report stating unequivocally that his torpedoes were running far deeper than their set depths, passing harmlessly beneath targets. The Bureau of Ordnance in Washington, responsible for torpedo development and production, dismissed his complaints with barely concealed contempt. The problem, Bureau officers insisted, lay with submarine commanders who didn't understand proper torpedo maintenance, with crews who weren't performing correct pre-launch procedures, with captains who couldn't execute proper attack approaches. The Bureau's position was that the Mark 14 torpedo was the most sophisticated, most thoroughly tested weapon in the American arsenal, and that any failures were due to operator error, not design flaws. This position would be maintained with bureaucratic obstinacy for nearly 2 years, while American submarines fired thousands of defective torpedoes and Japanese merchant ships steamed safely to port, with American torpedoes lodged unexploded in their hulls. Japanese intelligence officers, monitoring American submarine radio traffic, decrypting American operational messages through partial breaks in American codes, and interrogating crews from sunken submarines, compiled detailed reports on American torpedo failures. These reports reached Imperial Naval General Headquarters in Tokyo by early 1942 and were analyzed by intelligence staff officers who drew precisely the wrong conclusions. American torpedoes, they reported, were primitive weapons plagued by fundamental design flaws. American submariners were poorly trained and lacked the aggressive spirit necessary for effective combat operations. The vaunted American industrial capacity was producing weapons that didn't work, ships that were inferior to Japanese vessels, equipment that broke down under combat conditions. This assessment, based on accurate observation of American failures but fundamentally wrong in its interpretation of what those failures meant, would prove to be one of the most catastrophic intelligence judgments in modern warfare. Throughout 1942, the pattern repeated itself with numbing regularity across the Pacific. American submarines stalked targets, maneuvered into attack positions, fired torpedoes that should have guaranteed kills, and achieved nothing. The statistics told the story. In 1942, American submarines in the Pacific fired 1,442 torpedoes at Japanese targets. They claim to have sunk 211 ships totaling nearly 1.3 million tons. Post-war analysis of Japanese records conducted by the Joint Army-Navy Assessment Committee revealed the true figures were 109 ships totaling 41,871 tons, barely 3% of the claimed tonnage. Submarine commanders filed report after furious report documenting torpedoes that ran too deep, that exploded prematurely without causing damage, that struck targets directly and refused to detonate. Japanese merchant captains began reporting American torpedoes lodged unexploded in their hulls while their ships limped safely into port for repairs, the torpedoes carefully removed by Japanese ordnance personnel who examined them with professional interest and growing confidence. These reports reinforced Japanese confidence that the American submarine threat was manageable, that convoy protection resources could be allocated elsewhere, that the merchant fleet could operate with minimal escort and still maintain the logistics pipeline that fed Japan's war economy. This confidence shaped strategic decisions about resource allocation, shipbuilding priorities, and anti-submarine warfare doctrine. Resources that might have gone to building escort vessels, developing effective sonar and radar, training anti-submarine warfare crews, instead went to battleships and fleet carriers for the decisive battle that Japanese naval doctrine anticipated. The assumption that American submarines were toothless would persist until late 1943, by which time it would be too late to implement the convoy protection and anti-submarine measures that might have preserved Japan's merchant marine. The truth was far more complex and ultimately far more ominous for Japan than intelligence assessments suggested. The Mark 14 torpedo, designed during the Great Depression when testing budgets were almost non-existent, suffered from 3 catastrophic defects that masked each other and made diagnosis extraordinarily difficult. Understanding how these defects were finally identified and corrected requires understanding how the torpedo was designed, tested, and deployed. The Mark 14 torpedo was designed starting in 1931 to replace the Mark 10, a World War I-era weapon that equipped older S-class submarines. The Mark 14 was intended for the new fleet submarines then under construction, boats like Gato, Wahoo, and Tang that would form the backbone of the American submarine force. The design specifications were ambitious. The torpedo would be 20 feet 6 inches long, weigh 3,000 pounds, carry a 643-pound Torpex warhead, and achieve a range of 4,500 yards at 46 knots or 9,000 yards at 31.5 knots. It would be guided by a sophisticated gyroscope system and would run at a set depth controlled by a hydrostatic mechanism. Most ambitiously, it would be equipped with the Mark 6 exploder, a magnetic influence device that would detonate the torpedo beneath the keel of enemy ships, breaking their backs and ensuring kills. The Mark 6 exploder represented cutting-edge technology for its era. Instead of requiring a direct hit on the target's hull, the Mark 6 would detect changes in the Earth's magnetic field caused by a ship's steel hull passing overhead. When these magnetic changes reached a certain threshold, the exploder would fire, detonating the torpedo beneath the target where the explosion would be most effective. German U-boats had experimented with magnetic exploders in World War I with mixed results. British torpedoes used magnetic exploders with moderate success. The American Mark 6 was designed to be more sensitive, more reliable, more sophisticated than any previous magnetic exploder. The problem was testing. A Mark 14 torpedo in 1931 cost over $10,000, equivalent to roughly $200,000 in current purchasing power. In the depths of the Great Depression, with naval budgets slashed to the bone and Congress investigating every expenditure, the Navy was extraordinarily reluctant to spend money destroying expensive torpedoes in live fire tests. Instead, the Mark 14 was tested using exercise heads, dummy warheads that could be recovered after test firings. These exercise heads were filled with water and air to approximately match the weight distribution of the combat warhead, then fired at targets or through measured ranges to verify depth control and gyroscope function. After firing, the torpedoes were recovered, examined, and reused. This testing protocol seemed sensible and economical. It was also completely inadequate. The exercise head, while approximating the weight of the combat warhead, had a different weight distribution. The combat warhead contained 643 pounds of high explosive in the forward section of the torpedo. The exercise head contained water distributed throughout the warhead section. This difference in weight distribution affected the torpedo's trim and hydrodynamic characteristics in ways that wouldn't become apparent until combat use. Furthermore, no live-fire tests were conducted against actual target ships to verify that the exploder would function properly under combat conditions. The Mark VI magnetic exploder was so secret that submarine commanders weren't allowed to examine it or understand how it worked. The entire system was accepted for combat use based on mathematical calculations, laboratory tests, and exercise firings that never duplicated actual combat conditions. The first defect was depth control. The torpedo ran 10 to 11 feet deeper than its set depth because the depth control mechanism had never been properly tested with the heavier combat warhead. When engineers increased the warhead weight during final development, adding 80 pounds of additional explosive to increase lethality, they failed to recalibrate the hydrostatic depth sensor. Additionally, this sensor was poorly positioned on the torpedo's body, where water flow created pressure variations that confused the mechanism. As the torpedo accelerated to combat speed, water flowing over the hull created a pressure drop at the sensor location through Bernoulli's principle, the same effect that creates lift on aircraft wings. The depth mechanism, detecting this pressure drop, interpreted it as the torpedo being too shallow and responded by trimming the torpedo to run deeper. The faster the torpedo ran, the greater this effect became. Every Mark XIV fired in combat in 1941 and 1942 ran far beneath its intended depth. Torpedoes set to run at 10 feet depth, designed to strike a ship at the waterline, actually ran at 20 to 25 feet depth, passing harmlessly beneath targets. A simple laboratory test, immersing a non-moving torpedo in a pool of static water, would not reveal this problem because there was no water flow to create the pressure effect. Dynamic tests using exercise heads with depth recorders showed the torpedo running at the correct depth, but the depth measuring device in the exercise head suffered from the same placement problem and gave consistent though incorrect measurements. The defect was real. It affected every torpedo fired, but the testing protocol was incapable of detecting it. This defect alone would have caused massive problems, but it was masked by the second defect, the magnetic exploder. The Mark VI was designed to detonate when it detected the magnetic signature of a ship's steel hull overhead. In theory, this was brilliant. The torpedo would run beneath the target and explode under the keel, where the shockwave and gas bubble would be most effective at breaking the ship's back. In practice, the Mark VI proved wildly unreliable. The Earth's magnetic field varies significantly with location, affected by latitude, local geology, and other factors. The Mark VI had been tested near the Naval Torpedo Station in Newport, Rhode Island, where the magnetic field strength and orientation were suitable for its operation. In combat in the Pacific, operating near Java, the Philippines, Guadalcanal, and Japan itself, magnetic field characteristics were entirely different. The Mark VI, calibrated for Newport, failed catastrophically in the combat environment. Some torpedoes exploded prematurely, detonating 50 or 100 yards before reaching their targets, when the magnetic trigger detected the target's magnetic signature at too great a range. These premature detonations did minimal damage, merely alerting the target that it was under attack and allowing evasive action. Other torpedoes passed beneath targets and failed to explode at all because the magnetic field changes weren't sufficient to trigger the exploder in the actual operating environment. Submarine commanders, watching through periscopes as perfect shots resulted in premature detonations that did no damage, grew increasingly frustrated. They reported these malfunctions repeatedly, filing detailed after-action reports with recommendations that the magnetic feature be disabled. The Bureau of Ordnance responded by insisting that the problem was improper maintenance, incorrect calibration procedures, or failure to follow proper operating protocols. The deep-running defect and the magnetic exploder defect masked each other in a way that made diagnosis extraordinarily difficult. Torpedoes running too deep wouldn't trigger the magnetic exploder because they passed too far beneath the target's magnetic signature. Getting the torpedoes to run at the correct depth would presumably fix the exploder problem. But when depth was finally corrected in mid-1942, the magnetic exploder continued to malfunction, and the contact exploder revealed its own catastrophic defect. The third defect was in the contact exploder mechanism itself. The Mark VI incorporated both magnetic and contact firing systems in a single unit. If the magnetic system failed to detonate the torpedo as it passed beneath the target, the contact exploder would theoretically fire when the torpedo struck the target's hull. This contact system used a firing pin design that had worked reliably in older torpedoes that ran at slower speeds. The Mark X, which the Mark XIV replaced, achieved a top speed of 36 knots. The Mark VI contact exploder had been designed and tested for that speed regime. The Mark XIV ran at 46 knots, 28% faster, and nobody had tested whether the contact exploder would work properly at the higher impact velocity. When a torpedo travelling at 46 knots strikes a steel hull, the deceleration is nearly instantaneous and extraordinarily violent. The firing pin in the Mark VI contact exploder was relatively heavy, and it was held in place by a spring that had to be stiff enough to prevent premature firing during normal torpedo handling, but weak enough to allow the pin to move when the torpedo struck a target. At the Mark XIV's high impact velocity, particularly when the torpedo struck at a 90-degree angle as submarine commanders were trained to shoot, the sudden deceleration caused the firing pin to bind in its housing before it could strike the detonator cap. The friction forces on the pin during deceleration exceeded the spring force that was supposed to drive it forward. The result was that perfect shots, direct 90-degree angle hits, exactly as taught in submarine school, were most likely to be duds. Only oblique angle hits, where deceleration was more gradual, allowed the firing pin to function properly. This defect had actually been discovered and corrected in older torpedo models back in 1922. The solution had been to use a stiffer spring and lighter firing pin components. But when the Mark VI was designed, incorporating the new magnetic exploder function, the earlier lesson was apparently forgotten. The contact exploder inherited the old firing pin mechanism without any testing to verify it would work at the Mark XIV's higher speed. Japanese merchant ships began arriving in port with American torpedo dents, and sometimes with unexploded American torpedoes actually lodged in their hulls. The ultimate humiliation for American submarine crews who had executed perfect attacks. The cost in American lives and lost opportunities during 1942 and early 1943 was staggering. Submarine commanders stalked targets for hours or days, maneuvering into ideal attack positions at great risk from Japanese anti-submarine forces, fired spreads of torpedoes that should have guaranteed kills, and watched in anguish as nothing happened or as premature detonations merely alerted targets without sinking them. The morale impact on submarine crews was severe. Men who had trained for years to become submarine warriors, who took their boats into harm's way despite knowing that submarines had the highest casualty rate of any American combat arm, who risked their lives executing perfect attacks, saw those attacks fail because their primary weapon was fundamentally defective. Lieutenant Commander Frederick Warder, commanding the submarine Seawolf, encountered an 8,000-ton Japanese transport at anchor in Talamo Bay in the Philippines in January 1942. The target was stationary, unescorted, perfect conditions for an attack. Warder fired 4 Mark XIV torpedoes from point-blank range. He heard 4 dull clangs as they struck the target's hull. None exploded. The transport, alerted to Seawolf's presence but undamaged, got underway and began zigzagging while calling for air support. Warder reloaded his tubes with older Mark X torpedoes, weapons dating to World War I that lacked the Mark XIV's sophisticated features but which worked. The first Mark X exploded against the transport's stern. Warder fired another, which struck amidships and broke the ship's back, The transport sank in minutes. Warder's after-action report stated bluntly that the Mark 14 was defective and should be withdrawn from service immediately. The Bureau of Ordnance not only ignored his recommendation, but suggested in its response that Warder needed additional training in proper torpedo maintenance procedures. Lieutenant Commander Eugene McKinney, commanding the submarine Tambor, fired 8 torpedoes at a Japanese destroyer in April 1942 from a range of 800 yards. He heard 8 dull metallic clangs as they struck the destroyer's thin hull plating. None exploded. The destroyer, now fully aware of Tambor's position and bearing, counterattacked with depth charges that came close enough to shatter light bulbs throughout the submarine and cause leaks in multiple systems. Tambor barely escaped, surfacing after dark in heavy seas to ventilate the boat and make repairs. McKinney recovered 8 of his torpedoes floating on the surface, their warheads unfired, examined them carefully, and radioed a blistering report to Pearl Harbor detailing exactly what he had observed. The Bureau of Ordnance response accused him of improper torpedo handling and poor maintenance practices that had caused the exploders to malfunction. Japanese intelligence intercepts of these communications, partial decryptions of American submarine radio traffic, and reports from agents in American-controlled ports noted that American submarine commanders were blaming their own weapons for combat failures. This was interpreted as clear evidence of American technological inadequacy and poor training. Japanese anti-submarine doctrine, never prioritized because intelligence assessments insisted submarines were not a serious threat, remained focused primarily on protecting naval task forces rather than merchant convoys. Destroyer escorts and patrol craft, designed primarily for surface combat, lacked effective sonar, adequate depth charge equipment, and tactical doctrine for hunting submarines. Japanese naval construction priorities focused on battleships and fleet carriers for the decisive battle, not on unglamorous escort vessels for convoy protection. The breaking point for the torpedo crisis came in 2 incidents during June and July 1943 that finally forced the Bureau of Ordnance to acknowledge reality. On June 10, 1943, the submarine Trigger, commanded by Commander Roy Benson, encountered the fleet aircraft carrier Hiyo, one of Japan's most valuable capital ships, and a critical asset for Japanese naval aviation. Benson executed a textbook approach, maneuvering Trigger into perfect attack position at a range of 1,200 yards, firing range so close that missing was virtually impossible. He fired 6 torpedoes in a carefully calculated spread designed to ensure multiple hits regardless of the target's evasive maneuvers. 2 torpedoes missed due to Hiyo's emergency turn. 1 exploded prematurely 80 yards short of the target, the underwater detonation visible through Trigger's periscope but causing no damage. 1 was a dud, striking Hiyo's hull and failing to explode. 2 torpedoes hit and detonated properly, causing moderate damage that reduced Hiyo's speed and started fires. Hiyo, protected by destroyer escorts that immediately began depth charge attacks on Trigger's probable position, limped away for repairs instead of sinking. The carrier underwent emergency repairs at Sasebo and was back in service within 6 weeks. She would survive to participate in the Battle of the Philippine Sea on June 19, 1944, where her aircraft would attack American carriers before she was finally sunk by submarine Archerfish. That single torpedo failure on June 10, 1943, 2 torpedoes out of 6 failing to function as designed, cost the United States a fleet carrier at a time when every carrier mattered desperately in the balance of naval power in the Pacific. The loss of Hiyo in June 1943 instead of June 1944 might have prevented her aircraft from participating in combat actions that killed American sailors and aviators. The torpedo failures had strategic consequences that rippled through the entire course of the war. The second incident proved even more definitive in forcing the Bureau to act. On July 24, 1943, Lieutenant Commander Lawrence Daspit, commanding the submarine Tinosa on her second war patrol, spotted the 19,250-ton whale factory ship Tonan Maru No. 3 alone and unescorted south of Truk. This represented a submariner's dream target. The ship was enormous, slow, defenceless, and carried critical whale oil for Japanese industry. Whale oil was used in the production of nitroglycerin for explosives, in food products, and in various industrial processes. Sinking her would inflict both immediate material loss and longer-term economic damage. Daspit manoeuvred Tinosa into attack position at a range of 4,000 yards and fired 4 torpedoes. He observed 2 hits that stopped the ship dead in the water. Daspit immediately fired 2 more torpedoes. Both hit. 6 torpedo hits should have been more than sufficient to sink any merchant vessel. Tonan Maru No. 3 remained afloat, dead in the water but refusing to sink. With no enemy anti-submarine forces in sight, Daspit had time. He carefully manoeuvred Tinosa into a textbook perfect position, 875 yards directly abeam of the target, where missing was impossible, and every torpedo would strike at the optimal 90-degree angle. He fired 9 more torpedoes, observing each one carefully through his periscope despite Japanese machine gun fire from the target ship. All 9 hit the stationary target squarely at the optimal angle. None exploded. Daspit heard the dull thuds of impact through Tinosa's hull. Not a single torpedo detonated. Daspit, suspecting he had received a bad production batch from the torpedo factory, kept his last torpedo unfired for analysis by experts back at Pearl Harbor and cleared the area before Japanese aircraft could arrive. He had fired 15 torpedoes at a perfect target under ideal conditions. 6 had hit and failed to explode. 9 had hit and failed to explode. None had exploded prematurely or run wild. All had functioned perfectly except for the one critical function of exploding. Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood, Commander Submarines Pacific Fleet since January 1943, recognized that Daspit's experience represented a controlled experiment conducted under combat conditions. Lockwood was himself an experienced submariner, having commanded submarines in the 1920s and 1930s before moving to senior positions. He had listened to 2 years of his submarine commanders reporting torpedo failures. He had watched as the Bureau of Ordnance blamed every failure on operator error, poor maintenance, or improper attack procedures. He had seen the morale impact on submarine crews who were risking their lives executing perfect attacks only to have their weapons fail. He had read the intelligence reports suggesting Japanese merchant ships were arriving in port with unexploded American torpedoes lodged in their hulls. He now had proof, documented in Daspit's patrol report with photographs and detailed observations, that the contact exploder was fundamentally defective. Lockwood ordered immediate testing. His staff constructed a testing range where dummy warheads could be dropped from a pier crane onto steel plates positioned at various angles to simulate torpedo impacts. The tests revealed that the firing pin mechanism bound and jammed at high impact velocities, particularly at 90-degree impact angles. The heavier the firing pin and the stiffer the deceleration, the more likely the binding became. Direct 90-degree hits, the supposedly perfect shots that submarine commanders were trained to take, generated such sudden deceleration that the firing pin couldn't move fast enough to strike the detonator cap. The contact exploder was fundamentally defective, and the defect became worse with perfect shooting. The solution came from an unexpected source. During the Pearl Harbor attack, American anti-aircraft fire had shot down several Japanese aircraft. Engineers examining the wreckage at the Naval Air Station discovered that the propeller blades were made from a lightweight aluminum alloy rather than the steel used in American propellers. This material, strong enough for its purpose but significantly lighter than steel, suggested a solution to the firing pin problem. If the firing pin were made from lightweight aluminum instead of steel, it would have less inertia during deceleration and would be less likely to bind. Tests confirmed the theory. By September 1943, 21 months after Pearl Harbor, modified torpedoes with aluminum firing pins and other design improvements began reaching submarines at Pearl Harbor and Fremantle. The transformation in American submarine effectiveness after September 1943 represented one of the most dramatic capability shifts in naval warfare history. From December 1941 through August 1943, American submarines had operated with their primary weapon barely functional. 3 separate catastrophic defects, each masking the others, had rendered the Mark 14 torpedo unreliable at best and completely useless at worst. Submarine commanders had adapted as best they could, setting torpedoes to run at shallower depths to compensate for depth control problems, deactivating magnetic exploders against orders to prevent premature detonations, attempting oblique angle shots instead of the perfect 90-degree angles they had been taught. But these were workarounds, temporary measures that addressed symptoms without curing the underlying disease. After September 1943, with all 3 defects corrected, the Mark 14 became the weapon it had been designed to be. Depth control now worked properly. The magnetic exploder had been permanently deactivated in favor of contact detonation only. The contact exploder now functioned reliably at all impact angles and velocities. Submarine commanders who had learned their trade in the school of hard experience, who had survived 2 years of combat despite defective weapons, now possessed torpedoes that actually worked. The effect on Japanese shipping was immediate and catastrophic. Japanese naval planners, observing early American submarine operations through 1942 and early 1943, had concluded that the submarine threat was manageable. Convoy protection resources were allocated primarily to protecting naval task forces and troop convoys, rather than merchant shipping. Destroyer escorts and patrol craft focused on protecting battleships and carriers. Anti-submarine warfare doctrine emphasized protecting high-value military targets. The merchant fleet, carrying raw materials from conquered territories to Japan, and carrying finished military goods from Japan to forward bases, operated with minimal escort under the assumption that American submarines weren't effective enough to pose an existential threat to Japanese maritime logistics. This assessment proved catastrophically wrong once American torpedoes began working reliably. The submarine flasher, commanded by Commander Reuben Whittaker, intercepted a convoy off Indochina on December 22, 1944. Whittaker manoeuvred his boat into attack position and fired 6 torpedoes at 3 tankers. All 6 torpedoes functioned perfectly. 3 tankers, the 10,000-ton Omarosan Maru, the 9,200-ton Arita Maru, and the 9,200-ton Ottawasan Maru, carrying critical fuel oil from the Dutch East Indies to Japan, went to the bottom in less than 20 minutes. In a single attack, Whittaker had sunk over 28,000 tons of shipping and sent hundreds of thousands of gallons of irreplaceable fuel to the ocean floor. The submarine Barb, commanded by Commander Eugene Fluckey, achieved even more spectacular results. On her 11th war patrol in 1945, Barb sank 17 ships totaling over 96,000 tons, setting a record for tonnage sunk on a single patrol that would never be exceeded. On June 23, 1944, operating off the China coast, Fluckey executed an attack on a convoy in Namquan Harbour. In just 54 minutes of furious action, Barb sank 4 ships totaling over 15,000 tons. These were not lucky hits or random successes. These were precisely executed attacks using weapons that now worked as designed, delivered by submarine commanders who had learned through bitter experience exactly how to employ them to maximum effect. The statistics documented the transformation. In 1942, American submarines fired 1,442 torpedoes and claimed 211 ships for 1.3 million tons. Actual results, 109 ships for 41,871 tons. In 1943, as the torpedo problems were gradually corrected, submarines fired 3,937 torpedoes and sank 284 ships for 1,349,473 tons. In 1944, with fully functional torpedoes, submarines fired 6,092 torpedoes and sank 492 ships for 2,388,000 tons. The effectiveness improvement was roughly tenfold once the torpedoes began functioning properly. By the end of the war, American submarines had sunk 1,178 Japanese merchant vessels, totaling 5,053,491 tons, representing 54.6% of all Japanese shipping losses from all causes. More critically, they had sunk 201 Japanese naval vessels, including the aircraft carrier Shinano, the largest carrier ever built at 72,000 tons displacement and the largest warship ever sunk by a submarine. The toll on Japan's economy was catastrophic and fundamentally altered the strategic balance in the Pacific. Japan was an island nation utterly dependent on seaborne logistics. Raw materials from conquered territories in Southeast Asia, China, and the Dutch East Indies had to be shipped to Japan for processing. Finished military equipment had to be shipped from Japan to forward bases and combat zones. Food imports were essential to feed the population. Oil from the Dutch East Indies was critical to every aspect of the war economy and military operations. By January 1945, the Japanese merchant fleet had been reduced to barely a quarter of its December 1941 strength. Tankers carrying oil from the East Indies were being sunk faster than they could complete round trips. Cargo ships bringing raw materials were going to the bottom with their holds full. Food imports had declined to the point that rationing in Japan approached starvation levels. The industrial consequences rippled through every aspect of Japan's war effort. Oil refineries on the home islands shut down for lack of crude from the East Indies. Japan's petroleum production, which had never been sufficient for military needs even with imports from the Dutch East Indies and Borneo, collapsed to negligible levels. Steel mills closed for lack of iron ore and coking coal. Aircraft factories stopped producing for lack of aluminum, which had to be imported since Japan had virtually no domestic aluminum production. Training programs for pilots and sailors ground to a halt for lack of fuel. Naval vessels sat pierside or swung at anchor for lack of oil. The combined fleet, once the third largest navy in the world, and a force that had defeated the Russian Navy at Tsushima and dominated the Western Pacific in 1942, was reduced to immobility by lack of fuel for its ships. Army divisions in China, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific Islands withered from lack of supplies and reinforcements. Ammunition, replacement weapons, medical supplies, food, all had to be shipped from Japan, and increasingly those ships never arrived. Troops on isolated garrisons went months without resupply as submarines sank the freighters that were their lifeline. Battle casualties couldn't be replaced as troopships carrying reinforcements were torpedoed and sunk. The Japanese army, which had conquered vast territories and defeated Chinese, British, Dutch and American forces in the opening months of the war, found itself slowly starving in its fortified positions because the logistics system that sustained it was being destroyed by American submarines. The home islands faced potential starvation as food imports ceased. Japan had never been self-sufficient in food production, relying on imports from Korea, Formosa and Southeast Asia to feed its population. By 1945, those imports had been reduced to a trickle by submarine attacks on cargo ships. Urban populations in Tokyo, Osaka, Kobe and Nagoya faced increasing hunger as rice rations were cut repeatedly. Black markets flourished as desperate civilians paid exorbitant prices for food. The government implemented draconian measures to maintain control, but the simple reality was that Japan couldn't feed its population without imports, and submarines had cut those imports to unsustainable levels. American strategic bombing, which received enormous attention in popular accounts and post-war assessments, was actually secondary to the submarine blockade in destroying Japan's ability to wage war. The Army Air Force's firebombing campaign against Japanese cities, while devastating to civilian populations and psychologically traumatic, had limited immediate impact on Japan's war economy, because that economy had already been crippled by lack of raw materials, Factories couldn't operate without steel, aluminum, coal, and oil, regardless of whether they were being bombed. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August 6th and 9th, 1945, provided the Japanese government with a face-saving reason to surrender. But Japan was already defeated economically and militarily by that point. The nation simply couldn't continue fighting regardless of battlefield outcomes, because the economic foundation of its war effort had been destroyed by submarines. The final irony of this story involves the Type 93 long-lance torpedo, the weapon that had terrified Allied navies in 1942 and 1943, and that Japanese intelligence had cited as evidence of technological superiority. By 1944, as American forces developed countermeasures and tactical doctrine to defeat it, the Long Lance became increasingly irrelevant to the war's outcome. Radar warning systems gave American ships advance notice of approaching Japanese surface forces, allowing evasive maneuvers before torpedoes could be launched. Better damage control techniques helped ships survive torpedo hits that would have sunk them earlier in the war. Tactical formations that minimized exposure to torpedo attacks reduced the effectiveness of long-range torpedo salvos. Most importantly, increasingly aggressive American surface forces, supported by overwhelming air power, sank Japanese torpedo-launching platforms faster than Japan could replace them. By 1944, American cruisers and destroyers engaged Japanese surface forces with confidence born of technological advantages that outweighed Japanese torpedo range. American ships had radar fire control that allowed accurate gunnery at night and in poor visibility. They had reliable radio communications that enabled coordinated fleet actions. They had numerical superiority in virtually every engagement. The weapon that should have been Japan's decisive advantage in surface combat became a sideshow as American submarines systematically destroyed the merchant fleet that kept the Japanese war machine operating. Japanese destroyers and cruisers, designed to deliver devastating torpedo attacks in night surface actions, found themselves relegated to escort duty protecting what remained of the merchant fleet, a role for which they were poorly suited and which they performed inadequately. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 illustrated how completely the balance of naval power had shifted. On June 19, 1944, the submarine Kavala, commanded by Commander Herman Kostler, intercepted the Japanese fleet carrier Shokaku as the carrier recovered aircraft after launching strikes against American forces. Kostler fired 6 torpedoes at a range of 1,200 yards. 4 struck home, the explosions detonating aviation gasoline storage and triggering catastrophic secondary explosions. Shokaku, veteran of Pearl Harbor, Coral Sea, and Santa Cruz, flagship of Japanese carrier operations in 1942, sank in minutes, taking 1,263 crew with her. Hours later, the submarine Albacore, commanded by Commander James Blanchard, fired a single torpedo at the brand-new armoured carrier Taiho, Japan's most advanced carrier and flagship of the mobile fleet. The torpedo struck forward, causing what appeared to be minor damage. Japanese damage control officers, confident the heavily armoured carrier could handle a single torpedo hit, made a fatal error. They attempted to ventilate gasoline fumes by running the ventilation system at full power, spreading explosive vapours throughout the ship. 7 hours after the torpedo hit, at 15:32 hours, Taiho exploded in a massive detonation that blew out her sides and broke her back. She sank rapidly, taking 1,650 sailors with her, including Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's entire staff. These were not lucky shots or fortunate accidents. These were precisely executed attacks using weapons that functioned as designed against targets whose loss the Japanese could not afford. Shokaku and Taiho represented 40% of Japan's remaining large carrier force. Their loss in a single day, both to American submarines, crippled Japanese naval aviation at the critical moment when it faced the American fast carrier task force in the Philippine Sea. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, known to American pilots as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, destroyed Japanese carrier air groups so thoroughly that Japanese carriers would never again pose a serious threat to American naval forces. American carrier aircraft shot down over 600 Japanese aircraft in a single day, while losing 29 of their own. The submarines had struck first, eliminating 2 irreplaceable fleet carriers before American carrier aircraft even engaged the Japanese fleet. Japanese naval planners, still operating under intelligence assessments that had rated American submarines as a secondary threat, had positioned their carriers in waters patrolled by American boats without adequate anti-submarine screening. The result was catastrophic. The loss of these carriers meant that even if Japanese naval aviation could train replacement pilots and rebuild air groups, there were insufficient carriers to embark them. Japanese naval aviation, which had dominated the Pacific skies in 1942, was finished as an effective fighting force by mid-1944, and American submarines had delivered the critical blows that made that defeat inevitable. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944 demonstrated the cumulative effect of the submarine campaign and the complete reversal of the technological balance. On October 23, 1944, as Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force approached the Philippines through Palawan Passage, threading through narrow waters on the approach to Leyte Gulf, the submarines Data and Dace intercepted the column. The submarines were positioned along the expected transit route based on excellent intelligence from code-breaking operations, demonstrating the integration of communications intelligence with tactical operations that characterized American submarine warfare by 1944. At 0532 hours, Data, commanded by Commander David McClintock, detected the Japanese column on radar at 30,000 yards range. He maneuvered his boat into attack position, tracking the force for 4 hours while radioing contact reports that allowed Dace, commanded by Commander Bladen Claggett, to position for a coordinated attack. At 0927 hours, Data fired 6 torpedoes at the heavy cruiser Otago, Admiral Kurita's flagship. 4 torpedoes hit, the explosions tearing huge holes in Otago's hull below the waterline. Otago lost all electrical power immediately, her engineering spaces flooded, and she began to sink rapidly. Admiral Kurita and his staff abandoned ship, swimming in the oil-covered water as destroyers maneuvered to rescue them. Otago sank at 0955 hours, just 28 minutes after the torpedo hits, taking 360 of her crew of 800 with her. Data immediately shifted targets, firing 4 torpedoes at the heavy cruiser Takao. All 4 hit, the explosions breaking Takao's back and flooding multiple compartments. Takao didn't sink immediately, her crew managing to isolate flooded sections and keep her afloat, but she was crippled so severely that she had to withdraw from the battle escorted by 2 destroyers. She would spend the remainder of the war under repair at Singapore, never returning to service. Dace, firing from the opposite side of the Japanese column, targeted the heavy cruiser Maya, launching 4 torpedoes at 0956 hours. Multiple torpedoes hit, the explosions breaking Maya's keel and detonating her magazines. Maya broke in half and sank in 8 minutes, taking 769 of her crew of 1,000 with her. In a single coordinated attack lasting less than 30 minutes, 2 American submarines had sunk 2 fleet cruisers, crippled a third, and left the commander of the center force without a flagship, staff, command center, or effective communications at the opening of the largest naval battle in history. Admiral Kurita transferred his flag to the battleship Yamato, but he had lost his communications equipment, his charts, his operations staff, and hours of critical time during the transfer. His subsequent performance at Leyte Gulf, characterized by hesitation, confusion, and ultimately withdrawal, despite having American landing forces at his mercy, may have been partially attributable to the submarine attack that disrupted his command structure at the critical moment. Whether Kurita would have pressed his attack more aggressively with his original staff and command facilities aboard Otago is unknowable, but the submarine attack certainly contributed to the uncertainty that led him to withdraw when success was within reach. The broader strategic impact of Leyte Gulf was that the Imperial Japanese Navy ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. Japan lost 1 fleet carrier, 3 light carriers, 3 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 4 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. The ships that escaped, including the super battleship Yamato, were trapped in home waters by fuel shortages caused by submarines sinking tankers faster than Japan could replace them. Yamato had fuel for only a one-way voyage when she sortied in April 1945 for a suicide attack on American forces at Okinawa. She was sunk by carrier aircraft without ever reaching her target, going down with 2,498 of her crew of 3,332. The remaining carriers, without fuel to train replacement pilots or to conduct combat operations, sat idle while their aircraft were expended in kamikaze attacks. The decisive fleet battle for which Japanese naval doctrine had prepared for 40 years had been fought and lost, not through inferior tactics or insufficient courage, but because the logistics system that kept the fleet operating had been destroyed by American submarines that Japanese intelligence had underestimated catastrophically. By early 1945, Japanese shipping losses had reached apocalyptic levels that made continuation of the war economically impossible. American submarines operating with reliable torpedoes, sophisticated intelligence about convoy routes from code-breaking operations, and aggressive commanders who had learned their trade in the crucible of combat, intercepted and destroyed shipping at a rate Japan could not sustain. In January 1945, American boats sank 252,000 tons of Japanese merchant shipping. In February, 182,000 tons. In March, 269,000 tons. In April, 186,000 tons. Each month, submarines were sinking the equivalent of Japan's entire monthly shipbuilding capacity several times over. Each sinking represented not just lost cargo, but lost crews, lost shipbuilding capacity, lost strategic mobility, and another step toward economic collapse. Japanese shipyards, working frantically to replace losses, could build approximately 300,000 tons of merchant shipping per year at maximum capacity, assuming they had steel, workers, and electrical power, all of which were increasingly scarce. American submarines were sinking more than 3 times that tonnage every month. The mathematics were simple and brutal. Japanese merchant capacity was declining inexorably toward zero, regardless of anything Japan's navy or army could accomplish on the battlefield. By August 1945, Japan had virtually no merchant marine left. The ships that survived did so by hiding in ports, not daring to venture into waters patrolled by American submarines that controlled the seas as completely as any naval force in history. The human cost of the submarine campaign remains difficult to quantify precisely, but was certainly devastating for Japanese merchant sailors. These men, civilians serving aboard merchant vessels, died by the thousands as submarines torpedoed their ships, trapped below decks as torpedoes blasted holes in hulls, drowning in oil-filled waters, burned alive when tankers exploded, dying of exposure in lifeboats that drifted for weeks without rescue. Japanese merchant sailors suffered terribly. The Imperial Japanese Navy maintained no effective rescue service for merchant sailors, viewing them as expendable civilian personnel rather than critical national resources whose survival should be prioritized. Many American submarine commanders, operating under unrestricted warfare orders but retaining human compassion, surfaced after attacks to offer survivors water, food, and directions to the nearest land. Japanese military personnel, indoctrinated to view Americans as barbaric racists, often refused assistance, swimming away from rescue or refusing help rather than accepting aid from enemies they had been taught were less than human. The story of Japanese dismissal of American torpedo improvements stands as a case study in how intelligence failures compound into strategic catastrophe. Japanese naval intelligence officers, confronted with accurate evidence of spectacular American torpedo failures in 1942, drew the conclusion that American weapons were fundamentally flawed and would remain so. This assessment shaped resource allocation decisions that prioritized decisive battle doctrine over convoy protection and anti-submarine warfare. When American engineers systematically identified and fixed every torpedo defect, Japanese intelligence agencies were slow to recognize the transformation and even slower to convince operational commanders to adjust strategy and tactics accordingly. By the time Japanese naval planners understood the true magnitude of the submarine threat, it was too late. The ships had already been sunk. The merchant marine had been destroyed. The economy had been strangled beyond recovery. Victory in the Pacific War was determined not by the spectacular carrier battles at Midway and the Philippine Sea that captured imaginations and dominated headlines, but by the grinding attrition of submarine warfare that destroyed Japan's ability to sustain combat operations. The weapon Japanese intelligence had mocked as evidence of American incompetence became the instrument of Japanese defeat, proving that in warfare, dismissing enemy capabilities based on early failures is a mistake that nations make at their mortal peril. The American submarine campaign represented industrial warfare at its most ruthless and effective, demonstrating that numerical superiority, logistical capacity, and engineering capability can overcome initial technical failures to produce victory through sheer relentless pressure that the enemy cannot match or counter. Japan's navy sank not in glorious battle, but in the cold mathematics of tonnage lost versus tonnage built, a calculation where American industrial might and Japanese intelligence failures combined to produce inevitable defeat. The submarines that Japanese intelligence had dismissed as incompetent with defective weapons became the force that strangled the Japanese Empire, sinking more tonnage than all other American forces combined, destroying the maritime logistics system that an island nation required for survival, and demonstrating that wars are won not just by tactical brilliance or operational excellence, but by the grinding economic realities of industrial capacity, resource availability, and the ability to learn from failures and implement solutions. Japanese intelligence failed to understand that American failures in 1942 were temporary technical problems that American engineering and industrial capacity would eventually solve, not permanent indicators of fundamental inferiority. That failure of imagination and assessment cost Japan the war.